going to date myself a little bit this morning, but as a kid, I remember watching a television show called Happy Days. And I don't think I watched it when it first came out. I was too young at that point, but by the time I was in... It's true. It's true. It was 1974 it came out. I was 5 years old, so... Anyway, heckling, wow. So anyway, I was alive at least when it came out. But by the time I was in late elementary and middle school, it was being shown in syndication on reruns after school. And so I often would watch it before dinner time. And so the main characters, not everyone was alive when this was on. Parents were Howard and Mary Ann Cunningham. Their children were Richie and Joni. The guy who lived above the garage was a guy named Arthur Fonzarelli, the Fonz. And Richie's best friends were Ralph Mouth and Potsy Weber. And as I watched those reruns, I realized they actually had a third child. Remember, older brother Chuck. So Chuck was in a few episodes in season 1, and then he ceased to exist. He ceased to exist. The next 9 seasons, there's no mention of Chuck. There's not a sense that he went off to war or went off to college or got married or died. He never, ever existed in the mind of the writers. He was written off the show. Perhaps the people in charge didn't think he added much to the show, so he wasn't worth the investment or the time. And that sort of thing happens all the time in television. Characters are written off. Perhaps the public doesn't like the character, or the actor has become a pain in the neck to work with, or they want too much money, or they want to leave the show, or it advances the plot to get rid of them. It's good for the ratings. But let me just say, writing people off happens in this life. When that happens, we dismiss another person's value, we disregard them, we say they're not important, they're not worth any amount of time or energy. And without a show of hands, let me just ask, have you ever written someone off? Have you ever treated another person as if they were an annoyance, or you didn't want to be around them? Or on the flip side, have you ever been in the other position? Have you ever had someone write you off and treat you as an insignificant, irrelevant person that simply doesn't matter? We live in a world where far too many feel that the system, the government, you name it, they feel they've been written off, left out, treated as second-class citizens. Some feel victimized and they're fed up. And all we have to do is listen to the news, and we hear story after story. But on this day 15 years ago, you and I, we remember how some were filled with so much anger and hatred that they were willing to crash airplanes into buildings to write off American citizens and to send a message loud and clear how they felt about the United States. Sort of like those of you who are old enough to remember when JFK was shot, you remember exactly where you are. I will forever remember where I was. The thing to remember is these kids who came up today will never have a personal memory of that. Almost every kid in our congregation who's in high school and below, they're too young to remember it. But those of us who are adults remember it. I remember it partly because I was installed on September 9th as the pastor here. The bishop at the time was Ted Schneider, and he came to do my installation. Pastor Fultz, who was here last week, preached the sermon. I remember feeling that was a great day. You might not think it was so great anymore, but I certainly enjoyed that day. Had Monday off. And I remember coming into the parking lot here at church, and Roberta, was our joyous secretary for 3 decades, looked incredibly worried all of a sudden as she announced to me that the World Trade Center had been hit, and we all thought, well, it's got to be an accident. But we remember quickly how that day turned. I remember we quickly realized this was more than just an accident, and we started scrambling to figure out we have to have some sort of gathering here in the evening, some sort of vigil to help people and gather our congregation. I remember reading things like John 1, which was the promise, the light shines in the darkness, and the darkness will never prevail. And other lessons I've since forgotten, but I do remember that one being said, and I remember a lot of tears. We remember so many lives were lost, and we remember certainly the sacrifice and courage of those who searched for survivors, and certainly went into harm's way to help in the midst of chaos. Certainly it was a scary time that day and in the days certainly right afterward. But ironically, if you remember back that far, you remember that there also was an amazing amount of goodness, where superficial concerns seemed to subside. Materialism didn't seem to matter so much. Helping neighbors was on the forefront of everyone's minds. We gathered to support each other and pray for each other, and there was this sense of the pulling together. And we had a glimpse of, I think, what our country, what the world can be at its best when we rally together in support and care. But you know how time has a way of going, and we so easily can return to default settings, which are not necessarily always as outreaching and as caring. You can rattle off a list of challenges we have in a post 9/11 world of things to fear, specifically who we should call the enemy, who we should treat as the other, who we should not trust. You can do that in your own mind, but one of the things I see is that it can be so easy to get sucked into this vortex of complaint and get stuck there and never leave it. It can be so easy to resort to labeling people. The Pharisees in the story today, they're labelers. They label others always as sinners, people who miss the mark. It can be so easy for us to resort to stances that protect and isolate ourselves from those who are different from us, those who we don't know much about. It's easy to point the finger. But you and I, we remember always that first and foremost, we are shaped by Jesus. Jesus, who taught about the kingdom of God, taught about a different way of living, and he set the target. He set the vision of how we are to live in this world. And I think in so many powerful ways, it haunts us and challenges us to be more than we are right now. Because remember what Jesus, when I read the entirety of the Gospels, I see that Jesus really never wrote anyone off, did he? Never wrote a single person off. He didn't live to seek revenge. He lived to write everyone into this story of forgiveness and compassion. He wants us to be swept up in that so we can transform people one by one by one. It's to inform and guide our daily behavior. Jesus' parables, this is the story we would have read 15 years ago this Sunday. It's a very appropriate one. It's the parable of the lost sheep and the lost coin. And it reveals the obsession, ultimately, of God to reach every single person. And it's a reminder to us that everyone matters. We're not to ignore, and if we ignore, we lose people. They're left out, they're kept on the margins, they're kept simmering in anger, they're kept in behavior that's not helpful to them. We can't ignore it. The gospel reminds us that our call is to pursue intentionally every single person we can, but pursue them with a sense of we want to offer them grace and acceptance and the joy that can come when you change your life for the better. Some may say that's naive. I know I can be accused of being naive. I know it's a complex world that has so much more. But I remember there's this dominant missionary in the New Testament. His name is Paul. And Paul was a person who wanted to write off a lot of people. He wanted to write off the Christian people from the face of the earth. And Paul, in the story today, testifies to his story. He said, I was a blasphemer of God. I persecuted people. I was a man of utter violence, a man of terror. Not the greatest person to be around, but he said, there was this transformation in my life that God got through to me, and I am no longer this person in the past, but a new person dedicated to sharing the good news of Jesus in this world by my words and my deeds. I'm reading a book right now, and it's the quote in the very beginning of it is this: most of us have two lives, the life we live and the unlived life. And it says between the two stands resistance. Resistance stands in the way often of the gospel life. God got through the resistance in his heart and enabled him to become the person God was calling him to be. You know, I remember my seminary internship was at a school for juveniles. This person like me who kind of grew up clean in a, you could say I was probably seen as a decent kid. So they thrust me into this school for juvenile offenders. And it was interesting. These are kids who'd been arrested, who'd been on drugs, who'd been in gangs. They were on the road to doing some very seriously bad stuff if they didn't change. They certainly resisted who God was asking them to be. But I remember probably the most important Bible study I've ever had was reading Luke 15 with these kids who, in a sense, were so lost. And we read it from beginning to end. We read these parables, the lost sheep, the lost coin, and ultimately the story of the prodigal son. Asked them, who are you in this story? And every single one of them identified themselves as the lost. But ultimately, one of the things they said in such a profound way is, how cool is that in every story there's care for the one, there's care for me. One kid, Jody, I remember, he saw that story and it really changed his whole perspective. He said, if that's who your God is, I want to serve that kind of God. Thanks be to God.